All right, so we have a good group here assembled. Thank you so much for joining Conversations on Species Credits. My name is Doug Bruggeman. I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets, specialize in providing data science services for the mitigation industry and real estate industry, and in particular developing landscape scale approaches for mitigation. To put this webinar series together with the help of Greg DeYoung, Sara Johnson and Donna Collier and Craig Denisoff to address issues in species mitigation markets. I know a lot of us are very passionate about it and have dedicated a big portion of our professional lives to it and would like to see these markets work more smoothly and expand. So this is a platform to address the policy and science and economics of these markets. And today we have a very special presentation from Steve Martin, mitigation specialist at large, Ken Sanchez with RES, and Sara Johnson, executive director of URBA. And they're going to be talking about joint authority banking. So I know we all work hard to develop relationships to get this work done, and sometimes we stumble on regulatory barriers. So this is a great example of how we can start discussing these regulatory barriers and work across programs. So it's an important topic, and it looks like we're going to do another session on this in March, diving deeper into these issues. And so look forward to the presentation and the subsequent discussion. We'd ask that you post questions in the chat box and make those chats available to everyone. So pose the questions to everyone, and then we'll get to it in the discussion. And I think they are going to stop midway and give time for discussion as well. So with that, I think I'm turning it over to Mr. Steve Martin to lead.
Actually, we discussed this and we were going to let Sara kick off and do the introduction.
Okay, great.
Great. Thank you, Doug, and thanks all who have tuned in here. We're really excited to talk about this topic today. Joint authority banking certainly see a large opportunity to try to expand joint authority banks across the country more systematically and try to match the footprint that we see nationally with 404 banks. And this is especially a great opportunity as the Fish and Wildlife Service is starting work on their own species mitigation rule that hopefully will have an approval process that tracks with and really encourages and facilitates these joint authority banks between 404 and ESA. We do, just coming the context that myself and certainly Steve and Ken are coming at this from is more of a 404 mitigation centric perspective and the approach of having the joint banks being ESA and 404, but certainly there are other programs and opportunities for joint authority banking beyond those two, which we'll touch on as we work through this. We're first going to offer an overview of just the background on each of both mitigation banks, then conservation banks, do a bit of a comparative analysis, then talk about how we've seen that process work so far. And then we'll wrap up all three of us speaking to some lessons learned and reflections that we've had, particularly over the past decade, and then start to get into some best practices that hopefully will tee it up for a part two on this subject that would go into some case studies and what works and what hasn't worked. So with that, I will, Steve, turn it to you, and feel free to, if you want to, give a little bit more introduction of yourself, and we'll jump into the next slide.
Okay. Next slide, please. Sara's already summarized what the session is about. I'm retired mitigation specialist, formerly with the Corps of Engineers, currently dabbling here and there, doing little projects as they interest me. Go ahead, next slide. Among other things, it's important to realize, Ken, would you like to talk to this slide?
Steve. So I'm Ken Sanchez. I'll give a short introduction as well. I'm supposed to be retired. I'm a recovering regulator from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I spent 30 years with the federal government, about 23 of them as a regulator. I went to private industry, and where I am landed now, I work for a mitigation solutions company, restoration company. But I also wear another hat, and throughout my talk, you will hear that hat speak as well. I'm chairman of the board of a land trust that focuses on caring for, holding easements, holding endowments, and stewarding mitigation lands primarily. So sort of that three-legged stool, regulator, regulated community, and land trusts. Just as an introduction, multiple authorities, multiple agencies, and I'm sort of California centric. It's where I've worked primarily, and ran the conservation banking program in Sacramento for the Fish and Wildlife Service, along with a bunch of very able helpers who may be on the, hopefully are on today, and work with multiple regulatory authorities, multiple regulatory agencies in California. And it's been very challenging, but also very satisfying to understand and work with all of these agencies that are responsible for conservation of lands and waters in California. Just real quick, and we'll talk about it a little later, we do have an MOU in California that codifies, if you will, roles and responsibilities, authorities, responsibilities, and sort of our mission. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about mitigation banks and conservation banks and some differences and commonalities between them. Consider this a refresher for those of you that have dealt with mitigation banks and conservation banks. Clearly, they have similar but somewhat different purposes and goals. Mitigation banks focus on offsetting unavoidable losses of aquatic resource functions. Conservation banks offset unavoidable adverse impacts to at-risk species and or associated habitat. As far as mitigation banks are concerned, the other purpose or goal would be no net loss of wetlands. With conservation banks, you're looking at aiding in the recovery of listed species and potentially preventing future species listings. But there are additional commonalities. So neither mitigation banks nor conservation banks can be used as offsets until sequencing is completed. In other words, they're only providing offsets for any remaining unavoidable impacts. It's first necessary for the project proponent to demonstrate that they have avoided impacts to the extent practicable and minimized any remaining impacts before they would look at compensating for the unavoidable impacts. There are some other common interests. So with either a mitigation bank or a conservation bank, there is a banking instrument. It's an instrument that's been negotiated between the sponsor, the mitigation provider, and the regulatory agency. And it's governing how the bank is going to be established, how it's going to be operated and evaluated. Both conservation banks and mitigation banks have credits. That's the currency. That's the resource type that they provide offsets for. Both mitigation banks and conservation banks have to be established before they can provide any kind of offsets. And finally, although I suspect we could come up with some additional commonalities, each of them have service areas. These are geographic areas in which they can operate, in which they can provide offsets. And those service areas can vary depending upon the resource type. Go ahead, next slide. This is yours, Ken.
It is. So when we all three sat down to go through this, we all, at least I learned from the experience. It was a good exercise. I came up with this idea of the mechanics of this process. And really it hinges, the message here on this slide is IRT leadership, that there is going to be one person or perhaps more that has to lead a multi-agency process. And in California, with state and federal agencies, with state and federal mandates, with regulatory authorities that differ widely and very widely, a facilitator doesn't just, or a leadership doesn't just facilitate. They have to manage. They have to manage everybody, and it's a hard job. And I'm typically pretty blunt about these things. There are egos involved. My regulation, is more important than yours. Sort of mentalities at times. They're all important regulations. They're all important missions, goals, and a leader really needs to manage that process to see these things go to do what they're supposed to do, go smoothly, be streamlined, and to make sure that all of the regulations are met when mitigating. Some of my lessons, if you will, are you establish milestones where you want to be at certain times. You define what's important to everybody, whether it's a water or a species. Sometimes the regulations don't mesh well. As an example, wetland classifications between state and federal agencies are, everybody's got their own name for a wetland or their own idea about what a species needs and what is going to be measured in a credit or in a service area. So all of these things need to be managed, and they need to be discussed initially on how you're going to get to a document that satisfies the regulations and everybody's agency mission. Let's see, what else do I have here? The other piece of this puzzle is durability. Easements, endowments, management plans, those all need to be discussed and addressed with a large and varied group of experienced people. Everybody's experiences are different. And so those ideas need to be meshed, and understand what the priority is in the agency for getting a bank done. No agency has excess time to work on something that may not be a regulatory requirement. You have to issue permits. You have to work on species listing packages. You have a multitude of responsibilities. And I think there needs to be leadership, there needs to be a champion, and there needs to be somebody pushing this process forward. So, next slide.
Okay, so I'll take it from there. This is a little bit of an overview of the bank establishment process. You can see compared on the left, mitigation bank establishment process, and on the right, conservation banking process. They're very, very similar. Two key differences: mitigation banking process is currently defined in regulation. Conservation banking process is not defined in regulation, at least not as of yet. Mitigation banking requires public notice of the prospectus, making the prospectus available for public review and comment. Next slide. This is the process, a diagram of the process that is spelled out in the 2008 mitigation rule. It's a 4-step process. The first step, according to the regulations draft prospectus, is optional but highly recommended. Most core districts out there are requiring it. You see timeframes associated with each of those steps. The idea is that if a sponsor and an interagency review team are well prepared and all the homework's been done, then federal processing, IRT processing, might take ideally 225 non-consecutive days. I say non-consecutive because there are breaks between each of those steps where the prospectus or the instrument goes back to the sponsor to provide any additional information or revise the materials as appropriate. Next slide, please. All right, let's take a moment and perhaps see if there's any questions, and then we'll start to get into the meat. Doug, do you have anything?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat right now, no.
Okay. So building up to the idea of a joint authority bank, we've seen in the past, in fact, we're still seeing the use of 404 banks to provide offsets to other resources. For instance, water quality or carbon offsets. This is to address a problem in some parts of the country where there are few banks available that actually provide water quality or carbon credits. In those cases, 404 bank credits may be determined by the appropriate regulatory authority to be acceptable. One example of that comes from my home state of Virginia. There are a number of banks that have been approved by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality for certain subsets of their credits to be used as water quality offsets. Basically, they've determined that specific credit types provide appropriate offsets, and they've developed credit conversions accordingly. Obviously, this is a different stream of revenue for a sponsor. It likely could increase the likelihood of success. It's also potentially providing important offsets. Next slide, Doug, please. Perhaps more commonly, we've seen in a number of parts of the country use of 404 banks to provide offsets under the Endangered Species Act. Where this takes place is where no banks have been established in a specific geographic area to provide offsets for a species. In those cases, 404 bank credits may be determined by the appropriate regulatory authority. That would be the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA Fisheries, to be appropriate as offsets. One example wood be wood stork foraging habitat in Florida. In much of Florida, there are few banks that are actually providing offsets for impacts to wood stork foraging habitat. A number of years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined on a bank-by-bank basis which habitat polygons were providing appropriate foraging habitat for wood storks. What we're talking about is habitat polygons with few trees, calm, shallow water, generally between 2 and maybe 15, 16 inches thick, deep, and good density of prey. In that situation, they had developed credit conversions on a bank-by-bank basis to provide appropriate offsets. This is potentially a good short-term fix. It could certainly potentially encourage the development of additional mitigation conservation banks. There are some disadvantages to it, though. In this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service is not a chair of the bank. They have no say over the design of the bank. They have no say over financial assurances, over credit releases, management, long-term management. So it answers a short-term problem, providing an offset, but it doesn't address any kind of a long-term problem. Next slide, please. This then brings us to something that we're seeing in a number of parts of the country, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest, this idea of overlays, where one regulatory authority credit type is overlaying on a bank providing another credit type. So perhaps a 404 component, a wetland or stream component overlaid on a bank providing offsets for a listed species, such as salmonids, or vice versa, an ESA component added to a 404 bank. There are clearly challenges associated with it. This often means considerable deliberation over the instrument, and it can be tough because often the design of the bank is locked in, and it may be hard to modify that bank to better fit the objectives of the regulatory authority that's following on later. There also may be challenges related to coordination, adequacies of some coordination, and so on. So this is something that needs to be thought about very carefully. Next slide, please.
I think, Steve, not to jump in here, there is a question in the chat that came on that I think goes exactly to what you were just talking about.
Okay.
That you're talking about not using credits. You're not talking about using unused credits as opposed to credits for multiple purposes, distinguishing between not reusing credits for multiple purposes.
That's correct, and that's a key point behind joint banking. And in just a couple of minutes, I plan to talk about what the 2008 mitigation rule says about compensation. With joint banking, the idea is the bank provides baked-in offsets under multiple regulatory authorities, that when 404 credits are included, the Corps is a co-chair. If the Corps is involved, review and approval follows the mitigation rule, but also the policies of the co-chair agencies. The Corps is looking at timeframes, but the Corps' timeframes do not apply to other regulatory authorities, to other co-chairs for that particular bank. And a lot of folks are of a mind that joint banking is somehow new and very different. It isn't. It's been around for a long time, but it often isn't thought that way. We have banks with multiple chairs, such as federal and state counterparts. For instance, in states like Oregon, California, Minnesota, Virginia, Florida. And those state co-chairs have just as much authority over the release of credits and the approval of the use of those credits as offsets. Could we have the next slide, Doug? Here's what the 2008 mitigation rule says in terms of authority for joint banks, that those mitigation projects can be designed to address holistically requirements for multiple programs and authorities for the same activity. And that's an important point. You can't use the same credit to provide offsets to two different activities. Once a credit is used, once it is debited, it's retired. It's no longer available for use for another project. Now, that credit may have multiple attributes. It may have a 404 attribute. It may have a listed species attribute. Whether it's debited for 404 purposes or that species attribute, once it's been debited, it's retired. It's no longer available. The other part of the 2008 mitigation rule in that section indicates that it is acceptable for these 404 mitigation projects to provide mitigation under the Endangered Species Act. I think that gets to the question that was posted in the chat box. Next slide. And this is just the idea that there's a host of regulatory authorities for which joint banks could provide offsets, whether we're talking the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, Oil Spill Prevention Act, Executive Order 11990, and so on. And with that, I'm going to hand it off.
Okay. This is Ken again. So still building on the joint versus separate banks, the idea of one impact being able to go to one bank seems to streamline the process. It also is ecologically efficient in that it incentivizes if we can build multiple assets into a bank, it incentivizes bank sponsors to go out and buy maybe bigger pieces of land, or at least land that has multiple components that is attractive to the regulatory agencies. For example, you have a wetland that has a listed amphibian. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff. but it serves to stay on message. You have a wetland that has a listed amphibian that inhabits either the wetland or the upland and can contribute. This piece of property can contribute to water quality, and it may trigger other compliance measures with wetland preservation or water, like I said, water quality, things like that. It serves a purpose to look at this holistically, to go at it holistically as agency regulators. It incentivizes bank sponsors to go out and buy pieces of land that have not just one asset, not just one attribute that maybe has just a listed species or has a wetland. But the other part of this is what happens after the bank is sold out, the land is protected. You're looking at perpetual monitoring and compliance. And this is where my other hat sort of comes in. It gets turned over to a land trust or a land manager. And we all know that agencies don't have all of the resources they need to follow up in perpetuity, certainly on monitoring, visiting the sites. So it focuses land management to responsible parties that, are tooled to take on these responsibilities. The role of the easement holder and land manager in bank documents, identifying their roles, identifying their responsibilities, and building on the trust, the relationship with land trusts or land managers. Next slide, please. Again, joint banks and potential pitfalls. Well, I hate to be negative. I'm a pretty cynical person. There's lots of pitfalls. But again, it comes back to IRT leadership. It comes back to the team mentality to try to identify these pitfalls and to fill in the gaps. They have gotten very, at least in California, you get 4 or 5 state and federal agencies that have multiple directives for regulatory compliance, levels of scientific responsibility and understanding of the systems. And it gets very complex. You have competing interests in the agencies that may think that they supersede or have to be at a higher prioritization. For instance, monitoring periods. We're working on a bank now where we're likely to have different monitoring periods for performance and success, anywhere from 5 to 7 to 10 years. And so how do you develop and incentivize a credit release schedule with monitoring periods, success periods that wind out over a 10-year period? And I think I will, at this point, talk a little bit, or at least bring up the idea that we were talking about just before we started. This is where the pitfall of a zero risk conservation product is unrealistic in my expectation. In order to incentivize the industry to go out and get the biggest and best pieces of land, I believe as a regulator that we are all going to have to share that risk. Industry is willing to go out and spend a lot of money and do a lot of, to acquire a capital investment in acquiring pieces of land, and doing good science to, I think our science for restoration is at a very high level compared to, the olden days when I was slogging through the snow to school. The science of land restoration is pretty advanced, so that if the team sits down and you have a design, you have a piece of property, everybody agrees on the basics of it, that I think the risk, everybody needs to discuss what kind of risk they're willing to take in order to get a piece of property entitled with different agendas. You can't buy yourself out of poor restoration design. You can't buy yourself out of poor siting. You can't buy yourself out of the unforeseen circumstances that are likely to affect us in the future, like climate change, fire, sea level rise, things like that. We know they are going to impact these landscapes that we are trying to protect. So how do we build in that risk and still give credit for protecting this property? Again, I think this is just a philosophy, and maybe it was just something that I learned to live with, is that we're going to have to accept some risk and move forward, because things are moving very quickly at this point. Next slide, please. Again, this is a repeat of the slide before. The overlay idea, it is reality. I mean, I'm working on several banks now that I worked on as a regulator at the Fish and Wildlife Service that we entitled for a species. The state has now listed that species subsequent to approval of the bank, so we're having to go back and seek approval from the state, seek entitlement from the state for these banks. That's just the way, the chronology of the way the world is working. So the endowment's going to change, the management plan is going to change. Potentially, it is essentially a new bank. And if you can build these in as unlisted species, or as whatever theoretical regulation you may have in the future, carbon, water quality, phosphorus, things like that, if you can build those in and get the agency team to agree that as a concept, these are addressed well, and perhaps that bank will be easier to amend or revise in the future. Again, sort of the things that, on overlays, you need to keep your eye on the ball is, management plan, monitoring schedule, service area, credit tables, endowments. All of that is likely to change when new species are listed. The wetland rule changes. It seems we have a pendulum with the federal wetlands rules, and I don't expect that's going to be much different in the future. Certainly with the state overlays for states that have a strong regulatory background, building these in early is probably your best bet. Next slide, please. Yes. The agency coordination, again, I live in a little bubble called California. A long time ago, we figured out that sort of doing these banks, in a linear fashion, one person, one agency looks at it, then the next one, we thought we'd put our heads together and try to process these at the same time. We came up with an MOU. I would strongly suggest this is a good team building exercise, is that you have an MOU, you include players that maybe even are reluctant, that maybe don't regulate. We have NRCS on our IRTs. They participate at times. They're an important player relative to money and grants and land conservation, landowner relations, and they're a good partner to have at the table. We have an organizational chart, a food chain, if you will. Again, not everybody agrees with things at the IRT level, whether it's policy or a specific issue. And so you have an elevational chain where you can run this up to managers and help and have somebody, make a decision about, a certain policy call or a specific call on banks when these get as complicated as they are. Again, it comes back to IRT leadership. I don't like to see anything elevated. I would like to see everything solved at the, the lowest level, because that's people who are, really in the trenches, and as a leadership person at the top, delegating down, letting IRT members make their own decisions is probably a good idea. So the MOU is good. It identifies roles and responsibilities. It identifies missions. It gives everybody a common sort of objective, and again, builds that team, puts some leadership responsibilities with IRT leaders, and hopefully these things move a little bit quicker. Next slide, please. Steve?
Sure. This is just an example of the kind of tool that the 8 parties involved in California have developed. It's a template bank instrument. It applies to all 8 agencies. They've agreed to a common approach, common language, common tools. It does, as a consequence, tend to facilitate joint banks. So this might be something, this kind of approach might be something worth considering when looking at joint banks in other geographic areas.
Yes, sorry, Steve, I put this one on you. This is actually, again, you know, it's a California thing. We have templates. Steve said it well. These are very helpful. I don't think we could do our job really without them. We have templates for bank enabling instruments, bank instruments, management plans. I think that the other part that templates sort of keep constant is lawyer review. These are legal instruments at some level, differing levels according to the lawyers. Are they contracts? Are they not contracts? It is important to have lawyer involvement, get some agreement amongst agency lawyers agree about as much as agency biologists agree with each other. Not always, but at the end of the day, if the mission and the milestones and the focus is set, we have some great instruments, we have some great templates, and we have some great processes that help streamline the process. Thank you. Next one.
Great. Well, I'm going to jump in here now as we wrap up, and we're running a little bit over, so I'll stay brief. We wanted to put together, this is a lessons learned slide, and then we've got some best practices and open considerations that'll tee up for discussion. But really, great job, Ken and Steve. And I think these are the big takeaways on what we've seen are successful tools and philosophies that really would like to think about how can we collectively apply those nationally to see more of a healthy market and opportunity for joint banks. And so the first, just to summarize, is this concept of IRT leadership, but also individual agencies on the IRT and individual regulators being willing to work closely with sponsors that are interested in joint banking, to have more of a creative mindset and see the opportunity here and feel like they themselves, from their own agency leadership, have the coverage to really explore this and embrace it and move it along. So, so important, just the relationship there between the sponsor and the regulators, and for the agencies to feel like they have the leadership and authority to pursue these more creative joint banking arrangements. Then, as Ken and Steve were just talking about, so important too, where you can have templates that are guiding these review processes and guiding expectations for both an efficiency standpoint, but also consistency from review process to review process, particularly in geographic regions. Then next, thinking about how to incorporate some of these key principles that will keep us away from those potential pitfalls, how to incorporate those into accepted methodologies. Particularly as we were preparing this, we were talking about that principle of additionality and making sure that that's been addressed in joint banking. I know stacking of credits has been, one of the main concerns, and I think goes to Ted's question in the chat. And also this idea of, if we can develop methodologies and have these standardized practices, can you also have that reflected in publicly available protocols and tracking, ideally incorporated through Rivet? So also another good comment there in the chat, Ted. And then lastly, thinking about this very important component of durability, another principle, being able to incorporate that through the easement requirements, the endowment requirements, the perpetual stewardship and long-term management and maintenance, and ideally having those requirements from the Fish and Wildlife Service standpoint and governing ESA offsets also match the requirements for 404. So again, that's streamlined and we're seeing consistency. I'll pause and see, Steve, Ken, anything you want to add to that, and then we'll all go into the best practices.
Nope.
Great. Okay, Doug, I think we'll go next slide. And then here's some items, we can use to jump into conversation, but wanted to include this as really a summary of kind of what I've heard, at least over the years, from various members and bank sponsors trying to pursue joint banks or retool credits that were originally developed for 404 purposes and now retool those for other programs. No brainer here, maintaining separate credit ledgers, so important. And really, if you're able to incorporate that up front in your instrument, it provides a lot of peace of mind as well for the regulators. Then again, going to that idea of having the right philosophy on both the sponsor part as well as the agency, being willing to be flexible and pursue this joint banking opportunity. And we started from there to talk about, what are some of the ways that joint banks could be pursued after a mitigation bank has already been put in place, or if you're trying to cite a joint bank next to a large-scale PRM that already is providing certain benefits. So would love to hear more conversation around this idea of umbrella MBIs and adjacent PRMs. We've also discussed this idea of incorporating an instrument provisions as a best practice from the outset, include in your instrument basically an anticipation or an option to later add on other credits or use some of the credits that are approved for habitat offsets, including for the habitat offset needs of species that may not yet be listed but are going through the process. And then some feedback that we've seen, depending on different regions, is bank sponsors wanting to take, again, let's say credits that were developed under a 404 program and being able to retool those for other purposes where the credits produced and the ecological uplift produced certainly meets the program obligations outside of 404, but there's a sense from the regulators that went through that IRT review process of no, these are our credits, this is our credit ledger, and there's a reluctance to allow those credits to be retooled or reapplied. So wanting to discuss that, and I think that's something that too we can get into more on part 2 of this segment. And then lastly, just a wrap up reflection point is thinking about, from a business banker perspective, what are the pros and cons for joint banking? And we've summarized it here. There is greater risk, certainly greater risk in an upfront having to go through potentially longer and more complex approval process. But on the back end, you then have the benefit of having that diversified demand for credits. So trying to balance that and trying to, wherever possible, decrease that risk of a long review period that brings in uncertainty for bankers. If we can collectively tackle that, it will help incentivize more folks to invest in joint banks. With that, Steve, Ken, feel free. I don't know if Doug, we may want to leave that last slide up. Just to help conversation, and Steve can jump in, and also got a couple folks in the chat here.
Well, I see there's another question about ESA credits included in rivets. The answer to that part would be yes. Carbon? I don't know about carbon.
Not carbon at this point, although rivets is being used on a pilot basis in Portland Harbor, Portland, Oregon, to track NERDA credits. And there is a water quality trading module in rivets. It's currently functional for both Virginia and Iowa, and I understand that there's conversations about a couple of other mid-Atlantic states using it to track water quality. That would potentially be phosphorus, nitrogen, perhaps sediment and or temperature.
Great. All right. So at this point, I do want to invite folks, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that'd be great.
Yeah, I had a question about what using 404 credits or aquatic resource credits for water quality improvement credits as well. This is Marlene. I'm at WRA down in San Diego, California, and stormwater management is a big issue down here. And there's been talk at different municipalities about utilizing something called alternative compliance to meet MS4 permit requirements on water quality goals, effluent control, that kind of thing. And one of the conversations I really remember about that was, everyone was kind of talking about the power of using wetland and stream restoration as a way to help, using the power of those different ecological powerhouses in terms of nutrient cycling and that kind of thing to remove nutrients and other constituents from effluent. But how do you get around the issue of basically having a discharge into an aquatic resource, and how would that work? Do you guys have any thoughts about that and how that might work in a joint authority bank like this?
I could see the joint authority. This is Steve. I could see the joint authority bank providing some kind of offset for that activity. Obviously, one of the challenges is many of those MS4 authorizations have to be reauthorized periodically. So one of the big challenges would be the duration of the offset. Typically, 404 credits provide a permanent offset, and the question is whether the regulatory agencies would tolerate a permanent offset and even a transfer of liability. Liability transfer is probably what most mitigation bankers are actually selling. And in the water quality arena, often there is not a transfer of liability.
I would add to that. I can't really talk much about water quality and things like that. Just the concept of what are you getting now versus what would you get if you went to a bank? It's the permanency, the durability, the function. How do you measure those things and translate them into something a regulator would see as beneficial or satisfying the tenets of the law? And that's where the creativity of the regulators, the willingness of a regulator to take some risk. As I would understand it, there's not a lot of mitigation for a lot of things that are happening right now. So you're getting something better. Again, that's just sort of I'm just an old owl biologist sort of perspective on the world, not the water quality stuff is very, very technical and it's very science driven. So, bringing some science to it, it would help as well.
Here's another way that you could think about it as well. You could have a joint authority bank, but the credits could be spatially separated. We actually have seen a couple of those where a portion of the bank is a 404 offset and another portion of the bank is a water quality offset, with the understanding that the 404 credits are providing permanent offsets. The water quality credits are providing term offsets that would be reset or renewed on a regular basis. So the credits are not spatially overlapping. They're on the same bank, but geographically they're on different portions of the bank. And it might even mean different management regimes for the different types of offsets.
Great. Thanks so much for that question. Anybody else have a question?
Steve, this is Greg DeYoung. I wonder if you might take just a minute to talk about the EPA core workbooks and checklists and how they treat joint authority banks within those products?
Okay, thanks, Greg. It's not core EPA, it's an EPA product. The Environmental Protection Agency had contracted with Ecosystem Planning and Restoration to develop a series of interagency review team workbooks for prospectus, bank instrument, in lieu fee program instrument, and in lieu fee project. Some of the participants on this call were part of the steering committee, and the focus is to provide interagency review team members with a series of questions that will help them better evaluate the particular instrument, whether it's a prospectus or a bank instrument, whatever, in terms of those fundamental elements. So that would include things like financial assurances, service area, long-term management, credit determination, baseline conditions, all of that, through a series of questions that can be answered yes or no. It does include mention and consideration of joint banking in a number of points. It acknowledges that joint banking is a fairly prevalent practice. So there's recognition of it, and we're seeing recognition of joint banking in other arenas and other efforts.
Steve, thanks for the reminder that it's not core. Do we anticipate buy-in by the core, which would, give much more traction?
The core was a member of the steering committee. So presumably there is some buy-in. Certainly they did provide comments on portions of the effort, and like all the steering committee members, we gave serious consideration to all the comments and the questions, and made considerable modifications based on the comments that we received.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so we are going to have another session on this topic. And so they're going to dive a little deeper. And so I think in the interim, if you have further questions that might inform the next session as well, if you can get those to me within the next week or so, that'd be great. It's a critical topic, and so thanks for everyone for logging on. I want to give our speakers a chance if they want to have any final comments.
Steve or Ken, you guys are the star of this topic. I'll let you guys jump in and wrap up.
Star is hardly the word. Working with Steve and Sara over the years, and my other unworthy competitors at this point, I think that has been a real joy. And they are worthy competitors. I think that we're trying to bring the best science. I sound like a marketing person here. We're trying to bring the best science. I think we have a real motivation to provide a product that outlasts us. It is our brand after all. So that zero risk idea, we would love to have that as well, but we don't, it's just, I hope that doesn't stop us from doing good things.
I would add to Ken's comment, and that's that everything comes with risks. And we can certainly take actions to minimize risk, but we can never eliminate it. And actually, the whole layout of banking instruments is aimed at minimizing risks. Credits are released based on successful performance. Short-term financial assurances are posted to provide resources to undertake corrective action if it's necessary. The site protection instrument, whether it's a conservation easement or another mechanism, is there to ensure that the conservation project has durability. All of it taken together is an effort to better manage and minimize risk.
Great. Everyone, thank you so much. You can please email me further questions. And thank you for the steering committee for their support, and look forward to seeing you guys next month.
Great. Thank you, Doug, for setting this up and hosting.
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
All right, have a good week.
You too.